For most of modern history, we thought we understood what war looked like. Wars had beginnings, they had battlefields, and eventually they had endings. But the strategic environment we're living in today increasingly defies those expectations. Consider what we're watching unfold across the Middle East today. On February 18th, 2026, President Donald J. Trump addressed the nation, declaring the official opening of what he termed a, quote, strategic excursion against the Islamic Republic of Iran. In his televised remarks, President Trump stated, quote, "The United States is launching a decisive operation to secure American interests and ensure stability. This is not a war, as we have known it, but an excursion, targeted, resolute, and necessary." Now, as of today, early April 2026, the conflict between the United States and Iran has evolved into a multidimensional struggle with Israel engaged as both ally and actor. This is not a conventional war, but a sprawling contest characterized by compounding, convergence, and contagion, the hallmarks of modern strategic confrontation. Adding to this complexity is the growing intersectionality with the ongoing Russo-Ukraine war, what Russia continues to call its, quote, special military operation. The dynamics between these two conflicts are increasingly intertwined, with each amplifying the effects and risk of the other. Actions and reactions in the Middle East reverberate through Eastern Europe and vice versa, fueling cycles of escalation, proxy involvement, and strategic uncertainty across multiple regions. Recent weeks have seen the United States and Iran exchange cyber attacks, precision airstrikes, and targeted assaults on critical infrastructure, each sparking new waves of escalation. Proxy groups throughout the region and beyond amplify the chaos, while global shipping routes and energy markets reel from the fallout. Diplomatic ties are tested, alliance systems strained, and domestic opinion on all sides, shaped by the relentless flow of information and misinformation. Meanwhile, the Russo-Ukraine conflict introduces additional layers of complexity, ranging from shifting alliances and overlapping interests to competing narratives and resource disruptions. The intersection of these conflicts creates a compound contagion effect, destabilizing not only the immediate regions involved, but also the broader international order. The nature of this conflict is fundamentally, again, compound. Military actions reverberate through economic channels, political legitimacy is contested in real time, and every move is magnified by converging domains: physical, digital, financial, and ideological. With each escalation, the risks don't simply add up. Folks, they multiply, feeding a larger cycle of instability. The contagion is evident as violence, disruption, and uncertainty leap across borders and sectors, making traditional boundaries and strategies increasingly obsolete. Now, as the Iran-US confrontation intersects with the Russo-Ukraine war, the contagion spreads further, illustrating how modern conflicts are rarely isolated, but instead mutually reinforcing and globally impactful. Is this a war or something less defined? Governments hesitate to use the term, yet the reality is clear. The United States of America-Iran conflict is a prolonged converging, we'll call it a confrontation for the moment, resistant to simple classifications or quick resolution. It is a living illustration of how modern conflict can rapidly become a global phenomenon, shaping not just battlefields, but economies, societies, and the very ideas of what it means to succeed. The intersectionality with the Russo-Ukraine war underscores all the more how today's compound conflicts transcend boundaries, creating ripple effects that challenge established notions of war, of peace, and even of strategic success. And yet, governments again hesitate to call it a war. What we're witnessing instead is something more ambiguous, a prolonged strategic confrontation, again, punctuated by moments of violence. The convergence of the Iran-US struggle and the Russo-Ukraine war demonstrates that modern conflict again, is no longer confined to single theaters or clear definitions, but instead a web of intersecting crises shaping the future of global stability. In other words, what many analysts now describe simply as conflict. That distinction may sound semantic, but it has real consequences because conflicts today rarely unfold in just one domain. Again, military operations interact with financial markets, shipping routes, political legitimacy, alliance systems, in domestic public opinion. What begins as a regional confrontation can quickly ripple outward across multiple systems at once. In other words, modern conflicts are increasingly compound in nature. And that raises an important strategic question. If the struggles shaping the world today are less about short wars and more about extended conflicts unfolding across many arenas simultaneously, well, what does it actually mean to succeed? To explore that question, we're joined by someone who has seen these dynamics from nearly every vantage point possible on the battlefield, in command, and at the highest levels of American national security decision making. General David Petraeus served more than 37 years in the United States Army, rising to the rank of four-star general. He commanded the 101st Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq, later commanded coalition forces during the Iraq surge, and then led U.S. Central Command overseeing American military operations across the Middle East and South Asia. He subsequently commanded U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan and later served as director of Central Intelligence Agency. Today, he's a partner at the global investment firm KKR, chairman of the KKR Global Institute, and chairman of KKR Middle East, advising on geopolitical and economic developments worldwide. He's also the co-author with historian Andrew Roberts of the book Conflict, which examines the history and future of warfare through the lens of military leadership and strategy. General David Petraeus joins us next.
Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Welcome, everyone, to this special edition of the Civic Brief. I'm Dr. Ike Wilson. Now, for much of our history, Americans have thought about security mainly in terms of war, clear beginnings, sometimes even declared, decisive campaigns, and identifiable endings, also oftentimes declared as well. But many of the challenges we face today don't fit that pattern. Some involve fighting, but many don't. Some indecisively, others unfold over years or decades. Our guest today has seen all of that firsthand. General David Petraeus has commanded in war. He's led long-running campaigns and spent years thinking about how conflicts actually unfold in practice. His recent book with historian Andrew Roberts, Conflict, reflects that experience. Today, we're going to talk plainly about what that word means, what battlefield success on battlefields, what matters most, and what recent history tells us about the kinds of conflicts the United States is facing today and most likely to face going forward. General Petraeus, thanks for joining us on the Civic Brief. Welcome, sir.
Good to be with you, Ike. Thanks for all you've done back in the day, including when we were together and you were the great G3 plans officer of the 101st Airborne Division when I was privileged to command it in the first year of the war.
That's one. It was a privilege, sir. I look back and frankly use a lot of those lessons every day forward. Anytime there's an opportunity to have a rendezvous with you, certainly back in our time with 101st, a rendezvous with destiny. Never gonna forego those opportunities, sir. If you recall, we our last opportunity to talk face to face. Want to thank you again for the opportunity to join you in Tampa. At the Association for the United States of America for the U.S. Army, AUSA, where you invited down to University of Southern Florida here to give a talk, really using the book Conflict as a springboard for a much broader, as always is the case with you, sir, a much broader, richer, going from the tactical, grand tactical, all the way up to the grand strategic, and driven by big ideas and big thoughts and big actions behind those big ideas. So if you remember, just like I did in Iraq when we were together and I was serving as your chief of plans, I'd every once in a while, frankly, trying to keep up with you, and get, as a planner, a good planner does, try to get into the commander's mind. Um, maybe every once in a while get lucky and get ahead of it on occasion. That never happened in my case. I was happy to just keep up with you. But you remember, you'd come out either getting into the up armored Humvee or in the Black Hawk helicopter, and I'd be sitting in the back. I managed to do that after your talk here in Tampa. I kind of headed you off at the elevator and open up a very quick, brief conversation with you, frankly, about the book. One of the things I've been most impressed about the book, and probably, you know me, I'm an academic, I'm a bulldog with a lockjaw. I grab on the things, sometimes hold on them to them and shake them up about a little too long, too much. But the choice of the title of your book, and that's really where I want to start today with the conversation, give you an opportunity to use as a frame to really add your own frame and maybe even foil and fence and foil with the one I'm putting forward today. But I'd ask you the question of what inspired you. Why conflict? Why not war? Why not warfare? Why the choice of the term? It was a very quick engagement, as you are always very straightforward, shooting straight, a straight shooter, both in real terms as well as with words. Uh, you thought maybe the question was a little esoteric, certainly academic-y at the time, as in all things around in the world. A lot of happenings, Venezuela, Iran, Gaza, everything in between, Taiwan, and everything in between. Since our engagement, maybe the world has actually made that question a little less esoteric and a little more practical in terms of the choices and the things that we might be able to learn from those choices of what we call things, what we declare things as. And I'll start with the first question, but I want to give you the mic and then let you reframe what I've kind of painted here and just kind of get us started. But my opening question really goes back to that first question at that elevator. Why did you and Andrew Roberts choose the word conflict for your book's title? And most importantly, what did it allow you to cover that war or warfare might not, especially in the context of where we are today? Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, conflict is a bit more inclusive a term than war, even though war is debated as a term as well.
Yeah.
We're going to use warfare in the subtitle anyway, so rather than have repetition, conflict seemed to be the likely choice. And it did enable us to cover a variety of different events and activities and so forth, including some out and out wars, and then some that were a bit below the threshold of that to a degree. So that's why we chose to do that. I think it was the right choice. It's also pretty succinct. And so that's how we started it out. That's how we sketched it out. And then, of course, what we did is look at the different conflicts that we wanted to include in our study from the end of World War II to all the way through Gaza with the second edition. The real reason was that when the Ukraine war broke out, the full-on invasion in February 2022, Andrew Roberts called up, and we knew each other very well. We've done a lot of events together in the past. I've interviewed him on a variety of his books. He's interviewed me in a variety of topics.
Yes, sir.
And he said, there's not a book out there that provides the military historical background for Ukraine and what's taking place there, at least certainly not since the end of World War II. How would you like to write it with me? And I was delighted to have a chance to do it because I've been looking for a vehicle in which I could examine, revisit the two wars I was privileged to command: Iraq, where of course I was a 2-star, 3-star, 4-star commander on the ground, then Central Command, and then even after Afghanistan, then CIA, still pretty heavily focused on it. And then of course Afghanistan, where I served as the overall commander, having served as the commander of US Central Command prior to that, and then CIA after it. And I really wanted to capture my assessments of those two wars and to look at them through the prism, as we did for all of the conflicts in the book, all the wars. We used a prism that stemmed from an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership that I developed between the 3 and 4-star tours in Iraq, knowing that I was going to go back for the first time. I was going to be truly the strategic leader, the uh, overall commander of that theater of war. And I wanted to have this construct that would enable me to focus on what it was that I needed to do. And there were 4 tasks in it. First, to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy, to understand the situation on the ground, the nature of the war, uh, the human terrain, the physical terrain, the neighborhood, all the other dynamics, the ethnic, sectarian, uh, tribal, and political groupings, and so forth. And again, craft the right strategy, get the big ideas right. Then to communicate those big ideas effectively, not just through the breadth and depth of the organization, although that was first and foremost, but also to any other elements in society around the world who had a stake in the outcome of that endeavor. Then the third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. You're obviously not performing them at the level of a strategic leadership. You're performing your own duties, but that means oversight of not doing. And that's the organizational architecture that you design for the undertaking. It's the example, energy, inspiration that you should provide as a leader. It's attracting and keeping the best and brightest, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's the metrics that you use, and they have to be truly ratcheted down and precise, and clear definitions, and then clear sources of information. And then also how you spend your time, your battle rhythm, which is a crucial component of strategic leadership because it demonstrates obviously what you focus on and what is the frequency of recurring events, activities, meetings, and so forth. And ensuring that on that list, or on that battle rhythm, on that schedule of recurring activities, are those that enable you to, or sometimes force you, to perform the 4th task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, the changes you should make to the strategy as you achieve progress or experience setbacks. And so we use that intellectual construct, again, as the prism through which we examine these different wars, based in large measure on our conviction that the side that has the best strategic leadership typically prevails. Not always. You can structure some scenarios. In fact, you could argue that Ukraine has vastly better strategic leadership, President Zelensky and then his commander in chief of the military forces, than, say, Putin and his general staff. But the fact that Russia is 5 times the population and 12 times the economic GDP gives such a substantial advantage to Russia that perhaps even the great strategic leadership we have seen does not fully offset those situations. Although, as we will discuss, I hope, having just returned from Ukraine last night, my 10th trip there since the full-on invasion, it is extraordinary to see what Ukraine is doing, and in large measure, it is a direct result of very, very impressive strategic leadership and at a number of different levels, including in their military-industrial complex. I also wanted to revisit the war in Vietnam, which was the subject of my dissertation. Specifically, that was titled "The American Military and the Lessons of Vietnam," many of which I came to believe were the wrong lessons, and in many cases weren't learned anyway. But that was a case where we had the wrong big ideas for at least 13 years or so. We believed that we could conduct a war of attrition against North Vietnam and its insurgent partners on the battlefield in the South, and that conducted large-scale, large-unit operations, search and destroy operations, very substantial use of air power, often somewhat indiscriminate artillery, and so on. And it took us 13 years to realize that we could not win that war and that we should have been focusing instead on what we would describe as a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign, securing the people where they live in South Vietnam and making the enemy come to us rather than pursuing them in these operations in triple canopy jungle and rice paddies and mountains and so forth, going after an elusive enemy that only stood and fought when they felt that they could have a reasonable outcome from that. But despite the fact that, as we had told ourselves, at least, we won every battle, not necessarily the case, but yes, we owned the ground generally after most of those fights. That really didn't matter. And we could not kill our way to strategic success in that war. And it was, again, very interesting to revisit this and to realize that the great strategic leader of the Indochina wars of France and then the Vietnam War of the United States was neither French nor American. The great strategic leader was the Vietnamese leader, General Giap, North Vietnamese leader,
Yeah.
who, of course, prevailed at Dien Bien Phu, which brought about the end of the French presence in Indochina, and then oversaw the operations against the United States, in which they ultimately essentially forced our withdrawal, and then eventually conducted a conventional campaign to topple the government of South Vietnam.
So perfect segue. I mean, you've laid out a lot of the experiences and the lessons. The lessons learned, and again, you've walked us from the tactical up to the grand strategic. You've talked about quality being a quality of its own, but also quantity being bringing its own quality. And sometimes you may have, like President Zelensky and the Ukrainians, the right strategic leadership with the right big ideas and the strategic leader approach and model. But that still has to contend with some of the principles of war, if you will, particularly mass bringing a quality of its own. Many of these aspects haunting us today, particularly in the theater of war, the expanding contagion theater of war that we're talking about now, the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Very difficult to even figure out what to call this thing. And, in a public civic sense, that meaning of the thing really seeming to have an increasing play on the political will side of, say, a Clausewitzian remarkable or not so remarkable trinity, and can become a determinant of eventual outcomes and success. And maybe a disconnect between the successes at the tactical level. And I've heard you give speeches before. I've read your recent articles, particularly with foreign policy, on the incredible disruptive technological enhancements. A lot of them gleaned from the lessons gathered and learned from our Ukrainian partners in terms of the utility of drone warfare, some of the lessons that we need to be gathering from them. I want to definitely give you time to speak more to that, because I did not know you were just fresh back from Ukraine again. So I know you go regularly, and you don't just do stop and goes, as we aviators call it. You go on the ground, you go into the lines, into the trenches, spend a devoted amount of time, no less than 10 days or so on any of your visits, actually right there seeing this from the factory level, the industrial level, right to practice on the ground. Want to give you time to talk about that, because particularly with the Iran war or confrontation, maybe I'll just safely call it a confrontation. We'll figure out what it
That's
leads
a war.
towards later.
Call it Gulf War III.
Okay, then I'm much comfortable there. I wanted you to say it, not me, sir. Gulf War III, but increasingly the convergence and the contagion and the intersectionality of the Russo-Ukraine war and the implications on what's going on in Iran and in and around Iran and vice versa. Maybe I'll just pose that, and I'll go into our first question.
Let me just talk about the future of war in Ukraine, because
Perfect.
I've said for a number of years now that we have not been learning sufficiently nor fast enough from what is transpiring on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The character of war there has changed every 6 to 12 months. Began with what we would think of as a Cold War maneuver combat arms battlefield. Very, very familiar to those of us who served on the front lines of freedom, as we termed them, and along the inter-German border,
Right.
as I did as a battalion brigade operations officer in the years just before the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And very familiar from that regard, albeit with the beginnings of drone warfare. In fact, in some ways, it was where All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner, uh,
Excellent. Excellent.
as one great correspondent for the Washington Post described it, Max Boot,
Mm-hmm.
where you had traditional trenches, barbed wire, concertina wire, dragon's teeth, multiple lines, bunkers, and so forth. And then you're trying to break through those from either side with traditional tanks, mechanized infantry, engineers, artillery, mortars, air defenders, electronic warfare, all the rest of that. And but also with some new capabilities increasingly, which were quite precision munitions of various types. But then that evolved, and what you now have is a war in which 90% of the Russians being killed are taken out by unmanned systems.
Right.
And by the way, it's not just in the air, that's the predominant uh, battle, if you will, the unmanned aerial systems, but it's also at sea and on the ground. The Ukrainians really don't have a navy as we think of navies. They have unmanned maritime systems, which have allowed them to sink nearly 40% of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and force it to basically tie up in a port as far from Ukraine as they can get because they can no longer survive on the open seas. They have maritime drones that can launch air defense missiles, and they've taken down Russian fighters right over Crimea. They can launch other drones, aerial drones that get them closer to a location, say an oil platform or some other strategically important target. And then on the ground, actually, I don't go to the front line anymore. I was in trenches back in the Donbass,
Right.
uh, not long before the full-on invasion began, and you could still go very close to the front for a couple of years. But now it's called the death zone, and it's 30 kilometers on either side of where you have forward troops. And there's no longer trenches. You can't survive in a trench. You have to be in a hole with overhead cover and all the rest of that. It's quite elaborate. In fact, the Ukrainians have 3-story basically dug into these big holes, and they sleep in there, they operate from there, and so on. But 30 kilometers on either side of that is constantly under surveillance, except during the most inclement of weather. And so you cannot survive. If you come out and you're not very carefully concealed, you will be spotted, and then the hunt is on. You either get back to your fighting position. This is much bigger than a fighting position. Again, it's quite elaborate. You either get back to safety really quickly, and then, by the way, now they know where your fighting position is, or at least the entry to it, or you die. I watched in this last trip, we drove one day 14 hours alone just to get to a Corps headquarters, which is as close as you can get. And these are all usually in very substantial underground, former Soviet bunkers or air raid shelters or what have you, with elaborate entrances that could be a half a mile from it. People don't wear uniforms going in and out, et cetera. And then got a real feel for what is going on the front lines. Artillery is very hard to bring to bear now because, again, it's within that 30 kilometers. So there are ways that they can dig it in and have cover as well as concealment, but it's really hard. Then another location, which was a drone headquarters of a drone unit operating on the front lines or over the front lines. And all of a sudden, as we are sitting there being briefed on all the systems and ecosystem and systems of systems that they have, all of a sudden, one of the surveillance drones on a screen identifies a Russian soldier. And again, keep in mind, the attacks are no longer combined arms. That doesn't work. Tank cannot survive on this battlefield.
Right.
And by the way, much of the distances we drove were on roads over which there was mesh and on the sides as well to keep drones from interdicting the lines of communication from the rear to the rear of the tactical area. By the way, when vehicles are not driven in that area on the Ukrainian side. They're remotely driven.
Mm.
And they take supplies up, or they take the supplies up by drones, and then they bring casualties back at night on them, strapped to them, sometimes with a drone on top of them, helping navigate the way back. So this is a really transformed battlefield. But when that surveillance drone identified the Russian soldier, that became quite a hunt. And what transpired was, okay, then they made the decision which first person view attack drones were going to be employed. They had several different units, they had different readiness. They began launching them. They had to replace the surveillance drone 4 times while I was watching this engagement, because the battery life is relatively short, and you got to return to base when you hit about 45% left, or you might lose it.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant shifting to a new display. But this was seamless, and it was conducted on Google Talks
That's amazing.
with every unit on there, all the networks and so forth. But it was a complete air operation. There were no ground forces involved in it. And as they started attacking the individual, of course, he knew pretty quickly that he was under observation. He would try to get into the thickest of the wooded area, but it was not enough to give real concealment. He dropped his rucksack, he kept his weapon, he's shooting at the drones. And then it was a desperate race to try to get back to his original position. But now they know where the position is, and they just kept hammering it until there was no sign of life left. So this is a very, very lethal battlefield, and it's all about unmanned systems of all types, and as are the defensive measures. Another time I went out on a counter drone intercept mission. That was back in early February. It was the coldest I've been in decades. It was well below zero, a lot of snow on the ground.
Mhm.
And the skill of these pilots is extraordinary. In fact, they are now helping 4 countries in the Gulf
Yeah.
contend with the drones that most of those countries hadn't prepared for in the past. And again, we should have learned much, much more from this from the Ukrainians as well. For the last 2 years or so, they should have been teaching us rather than us
Yes, sir.
teaching them, because this is true transformation.
Yeah.
This is a whole new concept of war. It's all new organizational designs, including an unmanned systems force, a separate service, if you will, to the Army, Navy, Air Force.
Yeah.
It is completely different mode of operations. The software enabler here, the software platform that enables all this, and there's various layers and capabilities that are important there. It's a real ecosystem for
Mhm.
unmanned systems. And of course, they're not only producing what I would argue are the world's best drones at the lowest price by far,
Yeah.
they're producing massive numbers of them. This year, they will produce 7 million unmanned systems of all types. We will produce maybe 400,000 or so. And theirs are much better. The software changes constantly because the jamming, the other measures that Russia takes. They even have drones that now, because the jamming is so intense and the spoofing and so forth, that they have fiber optic cable that spools out behind them.
Wow.
And about 35 to 40% of the drones used on a daily basis have that feature. So it's obviously unjammable.
Mhm.
But what's coming soon, and not that long from now, there are already systems that go autonomous once they have locked onto a target, including a Russian drone. And these are the Shahed drones. Actually, it's an improved version of the Iranian Shahed drone that was given to them at the beginning of the war.
Right.
Um, all of this is really, truly breathtaking. And what we're seeing in Iran is just a small subset of this. It is not the future of war that's being played out on the battlefield in Ukraine. And what's coming is going to be autonomous systems. And now you don't need a remote pilot, so you're not limited by the number of launch teams and pilots that you have. Now the limit is your manufacture of them,
Yeah.
and you'll have drone swarms that are much, much more difficult to contend with than even modest numbers of drones all being flown in roughly the same location at a given point in time to overwhelm the enemy. So again, we should have been learning much more from Ukraine. We should be buying from Ukraine in many of the cases. We do not have drones of the quality that they have, with one or two exceptions. There's a couple of anomalies where there's an American initiative that actually is being used in Ukraine, being manufactured in Ukraine, but also manufactured in Poland, US, and Taiwan. But those are the outliers, because right now there's not a process, there's no laws that allow drone manufacturers in Ukraine to sell outside of Ukraine, nor even it's not encouraged to have a joint venture or something else. This will eventually evolve. But we, again, should be observing this much more closely, learning much more from it. And we have to literally overhaul our entire concepts of warfare and shift from what very simplistically might be described as a small number of very large platforms that are heavily manned, incredibly capable, exorbitantly expensive, but increasingly vulnerable, to a massive number of unmanned systems below the surface of the water, on the surface, in the air, on ground, in outer space, and even the equivalent in cyberspace in the cognitive space. And these will increasingly be algorithmically, not remotely piloted.
Right. Sir, correct me if I'm wrong, but what it sounds like you've just laid out, lots, but what really popped in my head is the pacing item, if you will, in military terms, the pacing item of this war, the drone and the drone operator system, the drone system of system.
Well, it's first and foremost, it's the concept
Yes,
of warfare,
right,
in which unmanned systems feature vastly more than they
right,
did even just 2 years ago.
right.
And then it's a military industrial
That's right.
complex that can produce these at
Hmm.
staggering numbers at very high quality, very low price. And then the overall ecosystem that enables the effective employment of them. And keep in mind, there's also other operations ongoing that are going deep into Ukraine.
Yeah.
There are operations where you ferry a drone in and then release it
Hmm.
and operate it. So they're going every single night against the most strategically important and energy enablers of the war.
Right.
So it's fuel storage, refineries, and so forth. And they're torching these, again, almost on a nightly basis. They have a very aggressive campaign in that regard. And but it all starts in the front lines, where
Mhm.
an attack now is one or two Russian soldiers running across the street or to the next wood line, and the chances of survival are pretty slim.
Well, these
The
are the
Russians have now taken 1.35 million, over that,
amazing.
killed and wounded, seriously wounded, and that's more than we sustained in all of World War II.
Yes, sir. The other two related things that popped in my head. You also seem to have said that the pacing war is not this Iran war. It remains the Russo-Ukrainian war. Would
Very
you
much so.
describe
I
it?
mean, there are elements of the war in the Gulf that are not present in Ukraine,
Yeah.
specifically stealth bombers and fighters.
Hmm.
And in fact, there's no close air support at all in this battlefield. The Russian aircraft generally don't even enter Ukrainian airspace. They have what are called glide bombs that can go as much as 45 miles.
Yeah.
You can see them on the common air picture that we saw, for example, the night we went out on the drone intercept mission. They have
Mhm.
very good acoustic as well as radar and other sensors that are all fused together to provide this. And you can see the Russian aircraft heading up toward the border, dropping a glide bomb. You see the trajectory of the glide bomb, but then the fighter turns around because they get knocked down if they get over airspace of either country or the occupied parts of Ukraine when it comes to Russian air defenses. That said, the Ukrainians are going after those air defenses pretty effectively.
Mhm.
And we'll see if there's a possibility where you can create, in a way, an enclave from the front line into the enemy territory or enemy controlled territory,
Right.
in which you could carry out traditional combined armament operations because you have suppressed all of the enemy's drones, surveillance, and targeting, and so on. But that's not yet really proven out. There are a lot of efforts to do that. You can do it, including with unmanned ground systems, on which, again, there are machine guns, grenade launchers,
Hmm.
mine laying capabilities, and so on. So the future of war is not in the Gulf. There are some capabilities there, to be sure, that are not present in Ukraine. But the real future of warfare, I think, is much more in Ukraine, and it's evolving very, very rapidly. And I think you'll see greater autonomous systems there within this year,
Yeah.
not even all the way into next year. And over time, and I hope you might post a link to an article I just had in foreignaffairs.com. It's titled The Coming Age of Autonomous Warfare, that I wrote with a brilliant American software engineer who's been on the ground in Ukraine since the beginning, and has helped them build this extraordinary battle management, common operational picture software platform, which has all kinds of different layers to it. By the way, there's a gamification of this.
Sure.
There's serious competition. You want to be the number one drone unit. There's rankings. You can go to the Brave One website, which is publicly accessible, and look at the rankings of the different drone units. And they get points. When you have a kill, you have to have a confirmation. So it's not just the video of the unmanned system that struck it. There's another one that actually, and it's uploaded automatically. There's quick adjudication. You get a certain number of points. They've increased the number of points for Russian soldiers over what they were before. It used to be, for example, tanks, self-propelled artillery, air defense systems, and so on. But it's one way of showing what is most important to them. And then you get points for this, and then you can use those points to buy weapon systems on the Brave One marketplace, which has many, probably 100 pages of weapon systems, many on each page. And they're delivered within a week or so to as close to the location of the using unit as they can get.
Amazing. Amazing. This sounds like the equivalent of Top Gun, at Miramar. I mean, for the drone systems, it's almost like a Top
Well,
Gun
it's
competition.
It's much more detailed than
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And again, it's vast numbers.
Amazing.
And again, each of these units has a running tally. So I
Yeah.
was just, again, with the Nemesis Brigade. I first met the Nemesis unit when it was an understrength battalion.
Hmm.
Then it became a full battalion, then a regiment of many battalions. Now it's a brigade of many regiments. It was started, one of the co-founders is a former prime minister of the country.
Right.
So they're all involved in this. And the leading manufacturers who were in Europe of Ukrainian descent have come home. They're the ones that are building these huge facilities, and it's very cutting edge
Yeah.
manufacturing as well. They're making
Yeah.
their own circuit boards. They do their own fiber optic cable. All of this, it's quite remarkable to see it. And the company I visited this last trip, for example, will make 3 million drones this year alone,
Incredible.
as something like 11 or 12 manufacturing facilities of many floors, huge factories, if you will, warehouses and so forth that have been repurposed for this.
Sir, you also give me a picture. You give us a picture of a very dynamically changing, transformational battle space. At the same time, there's a lot of it. You started talking about this 30-kilometer dead man zone, which brings up images of the stalemates of a trench warfare of the like of a World War I period. It seems like a combination of this 21st century dynamism, but still the ground speaks, and there are stagnant elements that derive from this. These areas where because of the technology, you can't survive, you cannot live in that dead zone, almost like the dead zone of climbing Everest. There's a point where you're dying and you've got to get up and get down and get out of there as rapidly as possible. We know what it took technologically and in tactically, technically, in terms of technological takeoff meeting operational methodological revolution to do the breakout, if you will, in a future of war and warfare coming out of the trenches, armor warfare, the beginnings of joint combined operations. What do you think, and are you seeing any signs of what that breakout might be in the leading edge here?
Well, you've got to figure out how to deny the enemy's ability
Yeah.
to bring manned and unmanned systems to bear.
Yes.
And you'd have to, as I said, create this kind of enclave
Hmm.
within which your forces can maneuver
Right.
and can move forward. And I think this is doable. They're stretching the distances constantly, the life of the batteries that are on these systems.
Right.
Again, about 40% of them don't come back. About a third or so are suicide drones.
Hmm.
And then there's a handful that get shot down on any given mission or have a mechanical failure or what have you. But I could envision where as you stretch the reach, the legs, if you will, of your unmanned systems,
Yeah.
that you can start to deny them the ability to launch theirs, to pilot them remotely and so forth. You might be able to cut the communications links. Frankly, the denial of service of the system provided by Elon Musk,
Yeah.
Starlink, to the Russians is a very big deal because it meant all of a sudden the Russians couldn't fly into the depths of Ukraine. So again, there may be ways of doing similar denial of key aspects, key capabilities that would then create possibility for some kind of maneuver. The other thing is, again, once whatever side gets drone swarms first
Right.
is going to be able to overwhelm the other side and may, again, make it possible to advance on the ground in ways that we haven't seen in probably the last year or year, and maybe even 2 years now.
And so, and just want to make this clear to our watchers, our listeners, in survivability that will allow that type of maneuverability. Is that correct, sir? The survivability piece, enhancing that piece.
Well, it's what you have to do again is create a safe area
Hmm.
for the use of whatever mobility you're
Yeah.
going to deploy. The Russians, they have soldiers on electric bikes, they have them
Right.
on scooters, anything to provide some mobility. The problem is that the density of drones and the surveillance makes it impossible to survive that. Uh, Again, it's a bit different in urban areas, to be sure, where you can
Sure.
get across the street, but drones are even going right into the buildings and pursuing these individuals as well.
Sure.
But so you got to figure out, how do you deny the enemy's ability to react to you in a certain area? The Russians were able to overwhelm the Ukrainians until this extraordinary advent of Ukrainian drone capability. By the way, the Russians are very good also.
That was going to be my
They're
next
very
question in terms of
they're
what.
very active. They're
Yeah.
sending drones every night into Ukraine. Maybe only 10% get through.
Hmm.
That is 10%, and they're bigger and faster and cause more damage. The missile threat is the one area which is a bit elusive when it comes to Ukrainian capabilities to defend against. So they're largely using Western anti-missile systems,
Yeah.
so the Patriot and others like it. And the challenge there, of course, is that it's much, much harder to get more interceptors for that, given the rate that we are expending them in the Gulf region.
Right.
Here I'm talking about U.S., Israel, and our Gulf state partners
Hmm.
who are defending their own territory against these and also against drones.
That's the perfect intersectionality, sir, in terms of a system, the missile systems, the ballistic missile systems that seems to be able to allow us to transition from Russia, Ukraine into this, greater Iran war, this Gulf War 3. Any insights there, any thoughts there in terms of where we are? It seems to me, just to provoke a bit here, tactically, and I've heard you talk about this a few weeks back, things are changing so rapidly, though. In terms of at the tactical level, it seems that we have very good still symmetry in terms of our tactical aims with that of the Israelis and, frankly, our Gulf partners as well in terms of destroying missile and nuclear sites. Operationally, it seems to be changing a bit, but I think there's still more symmetry and coincidence than non-coincidence in terms of degrading Iranian, military and proxies, or at least deterring, if not containing, a new 21st century kind of form of containment, perhaps. It does seem that we are, if there's a place where there is a possibility for disconnectedness and divergence, it's at that strategic level where, from a U.S. and maybe greater Western perspective, it's still more in the, again, I'll call it a broad sense of a containing of Iran, looking at now and into the future. But from an Israeli standpoint, and maybe even our Gulf partners, some type of more towards an ending of, a dismantlement of, and an ending of the Iranian regime and its system, its industrial war fighting, war waging system itself. Maybe
Well,
continue with
the
that, challenge that,
Iranians,
sir. Yeah.
the Iranians are sustaining very considerable
Yes.
loss. Obviously, very significant number of the most senior leaders have been killed. Their air and ballistic missile defenses have been very substantially degraded. Yes, they did shoot down an F-15 and a A-10 Thunderbolt, and thankfully we got all the pilots back. But by and large, we have air superiority
Yeah.
uh, very substantially throughout the country. Uh, we are indeed degrading the missile launchers, stockpiles, the missiles themselves, the manufacturing capacity and assembly,
Mhm.
doing some of that against the drones as well, although there's a lot of those and they seem to be some of those quite well protected until employed. There's a lot of damage that's been done to regime forces, their leaders, their command and control facilities, the all of the other aspects of that, their logistics, and so on. Um, the challenge is that this is a regime that is very resilient. There is an element of religious fanaticism, if you will, that really strengthens their ability to resist all this. They knew this was coming. You know from Iraq that there is a strain of Shia Islam that celebrates martyrdom
Correct. 12. Yeah.
and almost welcomes that and reveres it. And it's 1 million men under arms, essentially, if you add up all of the different elements that comprise the regime, some more fundamentally supportive of the regime than, say, others. So the
Right.
Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, then the conventional military. But again, you add it all up, and they're all willing to shoot and kill their own people in the tens of thousands, as we saw in a couple of days in January during demonstrations alone. That's a very substantial force, and it has proven to be very resilient. They already delegated command and various missions and tasks before all this took place. They identified who replaces the leader if he is killed,
Right.
and several deep. And then at the end of the day, they have a really strategically important capability, and that is the ability to prevent freedom of navigation and transit through the Strait of Hormuz. And that is significant because it's 20% roughly of the world's crude oil and liquefied natural gas,
Right.
and it causes enormous ripples. And it's not just first order, but it's second and third and fourth order effects that are very, very damaging to the global economy. And they also have demonstrated the ability to do very significant damage to the energy infrastructure on the other side of the Gulf.
Right.
I was just in Abu Dhabi and Doha, Qatar, a couple of weeks ago. The prime minister in Qatar said that they'd lost 17%
Mm.
of their LNG production capacity, and it's out for 3 to 5 years. It's very difficult
Yes.
to rebuild. And of course, nothing is moving through the Gulf and through the Strait unless Iran gives it its approval to that. And so it put the Gulf states in a very difficult position. It also points to lots of actions that will be taken after this to improve resilience, to provide all other ways of getting crude and LNG out of the region, then going through the Gulf and the Strait, hardening of infrastructure, improvement of counter drone capabilities, and the rest, and also ballistic missile defense capabilities. All of these are going to be very high priorities for the countries of that region. So this is a case where, yes, we are achieving impressive results in many of the mission areas, but Iran is formidably resilient with its regime.
Yeah.
It again embraces martyrdom and losses, and it has a trump card in the form of ability to control the transit through the Gulf and the Strait that is very substantial. And it would take a huge amount on our part to break that grip, to prevent them from being able to just carry out the handful of shots per day
Yeah.
that are all that are needed to prevent the kind of confidence that is necessary. This isn't about risk insurance for these ships. This is confidence that ship owners and cargo owners will not put lives at risk.
Right.
This is about the lives of their sailors. And until you have real confidence, you're not going to see the resumption of the normal amount of traffic through the strait.
Sir, and we're only talking about the strait. Something that's haunted me a bit is why we've not seen yet, perhaps, a similar action taken by the Houthis at the Bab el-Mandeb.
Well, no, that's understandable because there is an arrangement between the Saudis and really the Yemenis writ
Right.
large.
Yeah.
The Saudis are paying the civil servant salaries, including for those Houthis that are in that, and it's an important arrangement for them, an important source of revenue, and so they're carrying out limited activities against Israel, but they are not shutting down the Bab el-Mandeb, which would be very significant because the Saudis do have an alternative route to get crude oil out. It goes, instead of through the Gulf,
Yes.
it goes west to a port called Yanbu on the Red Sea.
Mhm.
And it's pretty substantial. It's 7.5 million barrels per day if it's full on. And then it would go down around the Bab el-Mandeb to
Mhm.
Asia, or
Right.
up through the Suez Canal to Europe. But a lot of it goes to Asia, of course. And by the way, the Emiratis can get about 1.5 million barrels a day down to a port called Fujairah on the Gulf of
Mhm.
Oman, bypassing the Gulf and the Strait also. And you'll see many, many more initiatives like this. The Iraqis, in fact, are now exporting crude oil by tanker truck through Syria. They just reopened a border crossing there that was closed for the better part of the entire time since the Islamic State created problems in that region.
So I'm fascinated by a reflection back on any given day, minute of the day when we were in your battle update brief in Northern Iraq and the array. And really, the whole conversation we've had, I've been imagining in my mind the type of battle update brief in organization for that type of strategic leadership and what you've seen and experienced evolving very rapidly in Ukraine and the types of strategic commanding heights, these pacing measures that would define the things that we're counting, the things that the systems that we are monitoring that would give us the indications of what's pacing this war in a traditional sense. We've mentioned some of the traditional indices, but mostly we've mentioned things that in our traditional way of understanding and defining what is war and warfare as non-conflict, it's military, it's not non-military. All of this is grade to say the least. Most of it, much of it, geoeconomic factors and dynamics. I'm
Well,
the
it's very
man,
comprehensive. I mean,
yeah,
it is literally the missile math, which is a
yeah,
very
in
important
the missile math.
issue in the Gulf, where they're constantly trying to figure out how many missiles does Iran have left, how many launchers, how many could
Yeah.
they shoot at us, how many interceptors do we have left, and how many launchers systems for employing the interceptor. So, I mean, there's lots of traditional stuff here, but really,
Sure.
what we really have to capture is the way that the concepts of war are evolving. And again, that's most prominent in Ukraine because that's the most cutting edge.
Hmm.
Again, to be sure, there are certain capabilities that they are not yet making. They can't make their own Patriot and missile systems and interceptors. that don't have stealth capability and some others that we have, but they're way ahead of us in the overall ecosystem for employing unmanned systems of all types and for the manufacture of those unmanned systems and constant improvements to them that vastly exceeds what we have in the United States.
So what we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a bit about Xi's China. What is Xi's China learning and gathering and learning and involved in all of this? How is that
Well,
adjusting the
she's
competition?
China first and foremost is enabling Russia.
Yeah,
They are providing the components that Russia can't produce on its own. Remember, in the beginning of the war, Russia was buying huge quantities of refrigerators, and they were basically mining them, taking them apart for the various components and
yeah,
chips and other
that's right.
items that they needed for their defense industries.
Right.
China is providing all of that, and China reportedly is very much going to school on this war, noting that if they seek to manufacture large numbers of unmanned systems, they have the manufacturing colossus of the world with which to do that. So again, I think they're going to school on this. When it comes to the Gulf, they're stepping back a bit. They're really staying out of it,
Hmm.
because, of course, they, on the one hand, they do have a relationship with Iran. On the other hand, most of their crude and liquefied natural gas comes out of the other side of the Gulf. So they have to be a bit cautious in that regard. Reportedly, they've also been providing intelligence
Right.
to help the Iranians, as have the Russians, with their targeting operations.
So what, a couple more questions. I want to be
Well, I
respectful of
think
the
we are
time.
going to have to start to bring it to a close here,
Yes,
I'm
sir.
afraid, because
Yep,
we're
we're right at,
approaching the witching hour.
we are approaching the witching hour. My last question, I'll just pose them right off the bat, both of them. I want to give you an opportunity to address, I know you still, myself included, you're a constant teacher or mentor. Um, what kind of advice do you give young, as well as not so young, but still learning, operational strategic leaders or those up and coming in terms of things they need to be focusing on? Maybe one or two things. What are the big idea directions? What are the directions they need to be pointed towards to gather, if not create, those
Sure.
big ideas?
Look, I think what it comes down to is the four tasks of a strategic leader,
Yeah.
because the up and comers are either going to be strategic leaders or they may be the uh, thinkers for strategic leaders, the strategy, whatever it may be, the speech
Right.
writers, the special assistants, and so forth. And so it's about understanding um, how war is evolving in this, if you're in this particular area, and anticipating where it is headed. And the best way to do that is, again, to understand what's going on in Ukraine, certainly awareness of what's happening in Iran, where there's some very significant realities that,
Yeah.
again, are ones that you have to take into account before you launch this kind of endeavor. But it's really about the future of warfare and understanding what the new big ideas are going to be. In fact, there are some Gulf states that have asked me to help them with how to carry out institutional change. And as you'll recall, we have a wonderful acronym for that in the US military. We did this, of course, when I was between my 3 and 4 star tours in Iraq in each of these areas. And it starts with, of course, D. It's Dotlam PF, but the D is the concept. You have to get the concept right, the new doctrine. We wrote the counterinsurgency field manual. Astonishing that we didn't have a field manual on counterinsurgency 3 or 4 years into those two counterinsurgency campaigns.
Right.
You obviously have to change the organizational structures to enable the implementation of the new concepts. You have to change how you train and operate. We did all that at the National Training Center, no longer tanks on tanks, but what you're actually going to face in Iraq and Afghanistan. You have to change all of your leader education, the commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer schools, in the curricula in those. You have to change what you buy and the material requirements for that. And by the way, nowadays you have to have a procurement system that you don't want just 1 million of this particular item. You want 10,000 of this one, but then a product improvement and a product, because it's constantly evolving so rapidly as we are seeing in Ukraine, and the manufacturing ecosystem that recognizes that reality. And then you've also got to carry out personnel changes, practices, policies, and get new facilities and so on. So that's probably where we should end, because institutional change at the end of the day is what we're all seeking to do. And so when I do go back out to the Gulf states that have asked about this, it'll be to flesh out DOTLM PF with their particular situation in mind and think through what it is that they need to do. And I can assure you that Ukraine is very much doing this. They may or may not use the explicit acronym that we have developed, which I find is very good. In fact, after having been in that 3-star job, the Combined Arms Center commander, where you also have 5 other titles and hats, which gives you in those days, gave you extraordinary authority and breadth of action. But when I went back to Iraq, every month I would, on my battle rhythm, have a 1-hour video conference with the individual who succeeded me and go through, this is what you need to change in doctrine, DOTLM PF, all the way down based on what we were experiencing in the war, in that war zone, and did the same thing from Afghanistan as well. So, but with that, we're going to have to bring it to a close. It's been great to be with my old plans, man. Delighted to see all the endeavors you have been engaged in since our time together in the great 101st Airborne Division.
Outstanding, sir. Always great to have a rendezvous with you. Thank you very
Pleasure.
much. Cheers.
Air assault.
Air assault.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.